And Sophie.
Yeah, so I don't have any fancy slides, sorry, but just to touch on sort of a few things that were mentioned in those two presentations, and also to sort of link public opinion and changes in that data to sort of the parties' positions and what the policy outcomes might be. I think one of the things that really comes across in a lot of this data is how important rules and processes are to voters. You know, the public's priorities when we talk about immigration now are really sort of control and transparency, and that's much more so than actually just numbers. So as Rob Ford puts it, voters care about sort of how immigrants come to the UK as opposed to how many come to the UK. So data shows that voters prioritise control over sort of cuts to numbers or meeting any sort of arbitrary target. And that might explain why, despite sort of record levels of immigration into the UK, we're actually consistently seeing positive attitudes from voters, as both James and Heather touched on. And that's to the extent that some data from the World Values Survey in February showed that the UK actually has some of the most positive attitudes towards migrants and immigration than any country in Europe. And that might be in part because voters do feel that, you know, the points-based system that's been introduced by the government since we left the EU and sort of the post-Brexit framework towards migration in general is enforcing clearer rules on who can come here and how. But I think it is important to note that these liberal attitudes towards immigration, or more liberal attitudes to immigration, they only really apply when voters do think that these clear, transparent rules on immigration are being enforced. So when the public think they're not, when they're seeing sort of pictures and videos of small boat crossings on news and on social media, their attitudes become much less positive. And as a result, in the last week, we've seen illegal immigration shoot up to become one of the top 4 issues that the public think the government should prioritise, particularly amongst 2019 Conservative voters. And so a hardline approach sort of towards this small boat crisis is increasingly being seen as an electoral necessity, I think, by the government. That's particularly because it is so popular amongst the voters the Conservatives want to cling on to as we go towards the next election. So the Tory party and its coalition of voters is very fragmented. It's completely split on economics and on some social issues, but small boats and a crackdown on illegal immigration in particular is an issue that does hold together that coalition of sort of very traditional, typical Conservative voters and those who are now considering maybe flipping back to Labour after 2019 or considering leaving the Conservatives for perhaps the Reform Party or not voting at all in the next election. You know, stopping the boats, as the government have put it recently, is the second biggest concern amongst 2019 Conservative voters, and tackling it reinforces that message of, you know, law, order, control that's very popular amongst those voters, and it's also quite helpfully an issue that the opposition are much less united on. So it's a lot more tricky for Labour to tackle these sort of social issues, if you will, and to balance that split in their voter base on these issues than it is for the Conservatives. I think there is a question of whether Sunak is maybe making a rod for his own back with this policy. You know, sticking stop the boats on a podium is quite a good bit of value signalling to those voters Sunak wants to stop deserting him at the next election. But if he doesn't actually stop the boats, there won't be much of an effect on sort of the results of the next general election. And the truth is, the government's policy, it's going to be quite hard to make it work in the short term, at least before the next election, to show any sort of tangible results. Because of, you know, lengthy delays in implementation, potential legal challenges, and also the lack of any real immediate deterrent to stop people from crossing the Channel. EU countries have been trying to solve this issue for years, and even with the Dublin Convention at hand, it's been incredibly difficult. And I think at a time when a lot of voters have sort of very little faith in government to deliver on any immigration controls, another failed attempt is hardly going to reinforce sort of trust or belief in the Conservative Party on this issue. You know, we had the Rwanda proposals, which most voters predicted wouldn't work just weeks after they were announced, and over 70% of voters, when they were asked in December, disapproved of the government's track record on small boats as it stands. I think the good news for Labour is that because of these failed attempts, the party's approach to immigration is viewed more positively than that of the Conservatives for the first time in nearly 2 decades. And I think it's actually questionable whether Labour will actually really have to do much more than just critique the Conservatives' approach to this issue, because even though concern over illegal immigration has sort of shot up in recent weeks, public attention to this issue as a whole is still some of the lowest it's been for nearly 20 years. And I think the bumps raised in sort of public attention and the salience of these issues because of small boat crossings, it tends to be pretty small and pretty short-lived, and also focused primarily amongst sort of Conservative voters who Labour aren't necessarily chasing for the next election. And it means that Labour might be able to keep sort of political focus on their preferred terrain, you know, issues like the economy, like public services, as opposed to the immigration issue, which is a bit more tricky for them to manage. There's also a structural trend which means in the long term, these sort of more positive attitudes are unlikely to shift towards immigration as the electorate becomes increasingly diverse and increasingly younger. And I think, you know, a hardline approach is going to increasingly appeal to a smaller sect of the electorate who are probably going to vote Conservative anyway, which risks the party looking out of touch, which, you know, when you're trying to win over people who say they're considering voting Labour at the next election, might not be a great approach, particularly if you end up not being able to stop the votes anyway. I think that's everything I've got to say.